So just throw out questions, ideas to them, things that are bubbling up in your mind, and then I'll sit down so you can have the floor.
Thanks. Thanks, all of you. I find when I talk to scientists a lot of the times it seems like for them news is when their paper comes out in Nature or Science, and they don't necessarily want to talk a lot or speculate about their unpublished data. But of course, for us, once it comes out in Nature or Science, every science journalist in the world gets to see it. So for us, it's more exciting before that happens. So how do you have ways of getting scientists to talk to you about that?
Well, first of all, you want a relationship, a long-time relationship with scientists, people you go back to a lot, and who trust you and you trust them. But there is one secret I shouldn't tell you because I like having it, and just a few of us know this, but journals are from the American Geophysical Union, the agu.org. They have an interesting policy that's different than Science or Nature or PNAS. Once a journal is a study is accepted and peer-reviewed, accepted, and written, edited, they put it's fair game. It's not embargoed. What they do is they post only the titles, not the abstracts. And trust me, you cannot judge a scientific paper by its title. And they have a website. If you ask the PR people at AGU, who are usually very good, they'll give you the link. And you just go through it maybe once every week or once a month and look at it, and you'll get to know names of authors. And those aren't published yet, but they're fair game. What you do is you look at the study, then you got to go back to the AGU and ask for the study. I mean, you get the title, you ask for the study, then you might see something. Be honest, it's about a 1 out of 15 thing, but then when you get it, it's good. So that's one way. But mostly you just really want to get a bunch of scientists you talk to in general, and not about their unpublished work, but about sort of the topics that they're talking about. There's this is something I'm still working to get, but haven't been able to get. There are a bunch of listservs that are meteorologists only, climate scientists only, and I keep trying to get on it, and they won't let me on it. But this is where they talk about things like the jets, this jet stream theory. This is where the term polar vortex came from, and then someone told me about it. This is where Greg Carbon did some studies on how unusual this cold weather was and how not unusual it was. So what you want to do is find some people who trust you, and you go back to a lot. And if you want, I have a list of about a dozen names I can just spout out at memory. You can look them up, and these are people, good scientists who are good explainers. There's a bunch of them, but you just have to know them.
Yeah, I think relationships are everything. A lot of what we did in this series was unpublished work that would be published about the time the series came out. And so we were reporting based on what we knew they were going to have. In fact, some of the stuff is based on work that I have a story that's going to come out next week. And a lot of sort of the tone of the stories we wrote knowing this paper was coming. And so you can do that when you have relationships with scientists that you've worked with for years and years, and use them to introduce you to other people in the field, especially if you have one or two great ones who have stature. I mean, that's how we got to Papua New Guinea, is we had a scientist call her and say, would you let these guys on your boat? And she said, do they know how to dive? And we said, no. And she said, well, then probably not. But he convinced her. So.
And the other thing, by the way, you get them to talk about the subject. You don't make it about their unpublished paper. It's about the issue, this particular subject field, or going out with them, This is, so you could say, oh, you're not going to get in trouble with Science or Nature because you're not talking about your study per se, but you are talking about this issue.
I'm going to defer to the science reporters here. That's great advice, and I just wanted to get Craig to maybe talk about how did you end up in your story when you were filming on the site when they were pulling up these slides that had been underwater for some time, and how did you arrange that? How did you manage to get there on time?
We did not arrange any of that. So the reality is that when you work with these people over and over again, and you spend a lot of time, you often just get lucky. And so this woman goes back to this site several times a year to do research, and it just so happened that she was pulling the tiles on this particular trip, and sometimes just that, it's like one of my pieces of advice is to get out of the office. And one of the reasons that matters is because when you're out of the office, you see stuff and meet people that you just aren't going to see and meet otherwise. And sometimes, you just have that kismet thing where you're in the right place at the right time because you've done all this advanced work. And that was really luck.
Yeah, no, Craig, I think you make your own luck, and that's what you did.
Yeah.
You say it's luck, but because you're out there all the time, you've made, that's not luck. You earned it.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Okay.
The lights are bright.
Well, kind of off of that, I feel like we're environmental reporters, and we could cover science we could just be science reporters all the time and still cover and it could all be science related to the environment. So do you have any kind of strategy for when you decide, okay, this is a scientific paper that I know that's going to come out or that has come out that I really need to cover, or this is something that, I've got other things going on? Do you have any kind of strategy for figuring out what are those, other than just your interaction with scientists to kind of figure out what's going on? How do you make that judgment?
Well, first, I think the biggest thing is, does it interest you? Yeah. I mean, if it doesn't, and that's the biggest hurdle. And then how interested am I? Because to be honest, where I'm at, I would say probably I'm interested in 1 in 10 studies at most. And my editors are interested in 1 in 10 that I'm interested in. I'm looking like everyone else for something weird and different and new and meaningful. And you've got to see, can you be passionate about this study? Can you pitch it to an editor who says no all too often? And that's, and then you have the doubts. And oftentimes before I pitch, I will go to a bunch of the scientists I trust and send them the study on an embargo basis. Say, is it, and just ask. You get an email system where you send it to one person and then strip out their name, and you could send it to like 7 people in 10 minutes that way. It's one, and then you get a good just general sense of what it's about.
Yeah.
I have a question for all three of you guys. I'm going to ask each one of you if you don't mind.
Or if we take one at a time, we'll
Oh, yeah,
keep on going
sure.
back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
So I would like to first ask the first question to the first speaker. And I guess it's kind of like a question and more like a phrase too. A lot of people do like to relate themselves to words. So like, new phrase words, like you said, climate change, which was something that happened in the, it was being discussed like in the 60s, early 60s, but people didn't want to really relate to it until like now, maybe 20 years later. And then we got like, new catchphrases like polar vortex. Oh, thank you so much. We have like new catchphrases like, polar vortex. And we have like old catchphrases like dead spots and things like that. And now all these things are coming together and people are kind of like, there seems to be something going on. I'm saying, for instance, like you were saying with the jet stream, which is associated to meteorology, if you will. All these things which seem to have some correlation, And so now people are like beginning to say, perhaps we are going through some sort of change, Do you find people becoming more interested in this type of science, in this type of reality which we're going to be living in? It's no longer kind of like a fictional type of thing or a catchphrase. We're actually living in this type of environment.
Actually, the catchphrase, it's sort of like that, that butterfly thing. It's wonderful when it works, but you don't really know when it's going to work. Polar vortex, I think Andrew Friedman now at Mashable, formerly Climate Change, and I were the first two to use it at the same, and suddenly it took off. I mean, I think television, Al Roker or someone started using that, and you don't know why it took off, but it did. And sometimes you think, I found that catchphrase, and then it just, for example, Sandy. Sandy was forecast about 5 to 6 days in advance, and it was supposed to be around Halloween. And the main forecast office here outside of D.C., there was one of my favorite forecasters who has a little bit of a sense of humor. did his forecast and called it Frankenstorm because it was coming in Halloween. And I just jumped on that thinking, wow, what a great phrase. NOAA then shut him down, not me. They shut him down on that. And I thought, well, here's the name. But no, Frankenstorm didn't catch. Superstorm Sandy, which I actually also used because, I don't like Hurricane Sandy because it's not just a hurricane. So figuring out what works is hard. I could tell you it's a lot easier to figure out what doesn't. The study that just came out linking the California drought and the polar vortex, they call it dipole. I could tell you right now, you're not going to hear a lot about dipoles.
In the back. Right, yeah.
The answer to this question might be actually fairly simple, but I saw a survey recently, it might have even been this week, that showed that only about 15% of the scientists quoted in climate change stories are women. And I was just curious if there's anything that reporters can do to decrease this perception of climate scientists as this like old boys field.
Yes, you can seek out women scientists because there are plenty of them.
And I'm going to tell you a couple right now. And what I tend to do is I tend to fall in love with certain scientists for a while and then use them frequently and then go back to others. My favorite of the moment is a woman. I actually saw that, and I have been already trying to increase the diversity there. Catherine Hayhoe, Texas Tech University. She's very media friendly. She's smart. She speaks in sound bites. She's an evangelical Christian and a climate scientist. What a wonderful combination. If you want to talk about jet stream, the scientist to go to is Jennifer Francis at Rutgers. Heidi Cullen at Climate Central is great. The trouble is, I have this odd relationship with Climate Central because they're also a journalist organization, so I'm never quite comfortable quoting them that much. I have quoted Ben, but there are a bunch, but you do have to seek them out. For example, when I did the Japan IPCC story, my advance was totally refocused by a quick interview with Patty Romero-Lancao at the National Center of Atmospheric Research. You were talking about who was the poster child of climate change, and it used to be polar bears. And she said, it's not polar bears anymore, it's us. It's like, oh, there's my lead. So you just have to seek them out. There are a bunch of them.
Yeah, and on ocean acidification, the paper that a lot of my work was based on that comes out next week was peer-reviewed by Sarah Cooley, who you guys met yesterday, and she's a great speaker, and she spent years as an oceanographer at Woods Hole. She's not just an activist, she's a scientist, and she knows everybody in the field, and she's a great source. So,
Greg, you and I talked about this yesterday, but I think it'd be this morning be general interest. When I did my stories on fracking, I found the environmentalists far too emotional to be really useful. And so I went everything was with the scientists. The same thing with peer review. The environmental groups, it was all, you're on the side of industry. Where they got that from. And I got it out of their head is where they got it from. So I was wondering if you had any more advice for this group. I've seen this before.
Well, I think you saw that in the slides there, one of the things I said was that peer review matters. And it's real easy to take science and then extrapolate to what you want it to say rather than what it actually says. And so, we just wrote a 6-part series, and there's not an environmentalist quoted in there anywhere. All we did was talk to scientists and then talk to the people who were impacted, what they found. And, not that there's not a role for environmentalists and journalism, but it's too important that this not be swayed by ideology. So we tried to stick with what people actually knew.
I think when you start quoting them, then your readers, probably correctly say you're coming in with a bias.
Exactly. So not only do you generally go only to scientists, but if you get a report from an environmental defense fund or Greenpeace, I don't read them even. I only look at science reports. And for example, just like I won't quote people like Mark Morano and other climate deniers who are not scientists, I also won't quote Bill McKibben and other non-science environmentalists. You keep it on the science and you're protected.
Yeah.
We have a microphone going around, so.
Thank you. Can can you each talk a little bit about how media was used in either, I mean, obviously in some ways, much more obviously, coming at it from a very visual perspective, but also just decisions that were made either in advance or on the fly, or challenges that you ran into and things like that. General media question.
So I mean, I work for a newspaper and we have a website, and but we don't do typically a very good job of incorporating all of that. And we had some vague notions that with this particular series we would try to do something different, but we didn't really know. And then we came back from Papua New Guinea, and in Papua New Guinea, which is our very first trip, Steve, the photographer, had never taken pictures underwater. He'd never been diving, and he had only been shooting video for a couple of years. And he did all of that, including shooting video underwater while taking stills underwater. And when he came back, we had like a little sort of huddle in our news meeting room, and they looked at what he came back with, and people's jaws dropped, and they were like, "We've got to do something better with this than we normally do." And that's how it happened. And so we have, in the series we were in, we have 12 videos. We have graphics that are motion. It was designed by a web designer who spent a lot of time thinking about sort of how stories flow. And it was done in part because Steve's work was so amazing.
So it was more of a one-off for your paper? It's not something that's incorporated all the time?
Well, so what they had to do to make it work was they actually had to build, we have like this sort of crumbly old engineering system in our website. They had to build a whole new website and then pipe it over to the seattletimes.com website. But now we have a template. And the idea is that they would invest some extra time in building this template, and now they're going to try and do more of that on stories that only take a day or two. But it took that upfront investment and a story that was sort of worth it visually to do.
And I'll just a real quick plug, you should also consider data visualization platforms. I say that on the microphone.
Yeah. I just
So
wanna-
data visualization platforms, and maybe you can talk to that after Steve talks as well.
Absolutely. So just picking up on what Craig was saying, I'm not really talk about specifics of the visuals in the film. I mean, it's sort of obvious. We had a punch, we had a list of places and types of people we were looking for. We went there, took a lot of time. We went there 3 different trips to Bangladesh to make sure that we covered everything that we wanted to get. But what I want to talk about is more along the interactive storytelling possibilities and what you get out of that. I've been involved in a number of these projects as a videographer and a producer, and find it very rewarding to work with print journalists and collaborate with other people from different news backgrounds. Once you get into the field, you hear and see things differently. It adds to a much fuller story online, including opportunities to work with infographics and visuals. And so I just encourage all of you, if you're doing climate change related stories, to collaborate with others in the newsroom to bring that story to life.
And in terms of, for me, it's a very sore subject. In terms of television, video and pictures, we have a AP television. It's just doesn't quite work out. So what I have done is going much more interested in the social media, and one of the few places where AP can make money, and it doesn't make enough, is in the AP mobile app. So I created, actually, hopefully my bosses don't know this, but I pitched to them, and we now have a semi-regular feature we call Go Figure, which is supposed to be for the mobile, essentially. That is a very bright, short, newsy feature that tells a story through numbers. And I've done everything from economics to sports and that type of stuff, but it's designed for science.
One second, there's
A microphone.
This is a question for Seth, but it's an excuse to say that I live down in Atlanta, outside of Atlanta, and every morning I sit and read the New York Times, and my wife sits and reads the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And every time there's a Seth Borenstein story in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I put down my New York Times story, and she reads it to me.
Because it won't be in the New York Times, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. No, but it's always succinct because it's AP, and it's always fascinating because it's you. And, yesterday people were talking about broccoli, and they were trying to feed us broccoli. Well, you feed us broccoli, and you make it taste like cotton candy. I mean, and that's a compliment, not a...
Thank you.
So, anyway, the question is this. I'm sort of new to this issue, and a lot of stuff yesterday was from the IPCC. You give me the opportunity to ask a question I couldn't ask the presenters yesterday because they were very proud of their involvement in the IPCC. And you started off by lampooning it a little. So what can a reporter, a journalist take of value? How do we use it? Steve, you said you poured over it on your way to do a story. Is there something a way I can use that?
Oh, it's a giant story tip book. It's wonderful stuff. You can use the IPCC document as sort of this is what science believes. You don't have to go in for, on the other hand, and all that. If it's in the IPCC document, it's pretty, you can go with it. It's also fairly conservative, so some of the most interesting stuff won't be in it. So don't go for it for the hottest stuff. Go for it for the most solid things. And there's 30 chapters in the IPCC. There's a chapter just on North America. There is a chapter there's 3 or 4 chapters on adaptation, and God only knows why. Chapter just on water. So it's a great place to find story ideas. It's a great place to find facts. It's a great place to find the studies because they always are footnoted. It's just not a well-written place. The scientists are all very good. And most of them are nice people, and there are some exceptions. So it's a place to go to for everything except words. Sources are the names are on top of them, and you will find some were very good and some try to be good and aren't. When I was in Japan, I was talking to one of the lead author about the North America chapter. That's Patty Romero-Lancao, and she's very good. And we were talking about one of her colleagues who I've gone to several times and cannot, no matter how hard he tries, speak a coherent and interesting sentence.
Yeah, I would just say that when I was going to Bangladesh, and I was at the time, focused on the Himalayan ice melt. And as we know, that part of the IPCC report was later screwed up. So while that didn't really change my focus at the time, I didn't know that it was wrong. I had really, as Seth said, taken this as this has been peer reviewed. This is very gospel, language, and I did find some good sources in there that I was able to interview in India and Bangladesh. But there are still pitfalls out there. Years later, we found out that section of the report was incorrect. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I put up there in one of my slides was, do you use Google Scholar? I mean, it's amazing.
Google Scholar is wonderful.
Yeah, and you literally just put in Chesapeake Bay and climate and salinity and the years 2010 to 2012, and you can find like 18 studies, and then you just look at the headlines in the abstract and see if any of them are worth doing something more on. And when I was trying to I ended up reading 150 or 200 papers for this series that we did. But one of the things that I did was go for review papers, because the authors of review papers, not only have they read everything and pulled out the best stuff, but most of the scientists are focused solely on their world. So the oceanographers really understand the carbonate system, but they don't really know much about the impacts on animals, for example. The review papers, somebody's gone through and read everything and said, here's everything we know to date about what this is going to mean for animals. And in any given year, there's 2 or 3 of those. And you can read that, and those authors have, they have a much broader worldview than the people who are doing like, just the carbonate chemistry or something. So and I do that just looking for story ideas sometimes.
And the IPCC is sort of the review of review papers. So one other thing about IPCC is it's not monolithic. You have 3 reports essentially, and they're done in so different ways, and their press friendliness is different. I mean, for example, Working Group 2, Chris Field, who runs it, is a scientist out of the Carnegie Institution out in Stanford. Very media friendly. The idea was they were going to get it to us embargoed 3 days early, except they didn't finish. They got it embargoed to us 12 hours early. This previous time, 7 years earlier, all the entire IPC sessions, all of them are behind closed doors, and reporters aren't allowed in. So I do what everyone else would do, is I stand outside and talk to smokers. And the IPCC chair of that time, of that group, would come out and scream at me and scream at the people talking to me. Of course, we got back at him because I had a colleague who looked like a scientist, and the late Steve Schneider, who was one of the leaders in IPCC, snuck him in for the final negotiations, and he's texting me everything that's going on. And so we had it we got around their session. But so they don't help themselves, but it's not monolithic. So
What does a scientist look like, Seth?
the guy who was about 65. He retired a year later. He just had sort of this gravitas look about him. Yeah,
I think,
an old white guy.
Beyond posing like scientists to get in to these places to get your stories, or these reports, in terms of putting a human face on some of these climate change stories. I mean, I've used this technique with other topics, but I like to search environmental prizes, different prizes that are given out that might relate to the topic that you're looking at. Now, some of them, will have already been covered because, given the stature of the prize, these people may have been covered. But there's things like the Goldman Environmental Prize. There's a lot of different innovations and environmental science awards and these types of things. And I troll all that stuff all the time, looking for potential characters. A lot of times they're local people with local solutions and different, and they might just help put a face on an issue, difficult issue.
Thank you. My next question is to the next speaker. And I know that you spoke about ocean acidification, as well as, showing documentary of the oysters' death. I guess my question is, the information that you provided, for instance, I see there's like a correlation, excuse the pun, like Neo, because there is a movie called Neo and the Fish, and that kind of, like kids get involved because of, you say Neo or something like that, and they want to get more involved with the environment. But on a more serious note, I mean, we are literally all being affected by the environment. And so, but it seems like with this video that you did, it made it very real, because you had 2 comparisons. You had what a healthy environment can look like, and then you also had what a non-healthy environment can look like. And I think it was much more, from what just from my own personal opinion and own perspective, is that it was much more impactful, because, it's tangible, and I think that really brings the story home, and so I guess my question is, should more, science journalists, writers, should they focus on more of a approach like that? Because it just seemed, you could actually see, like, for instance, the coral reef, which is.
Yeah, I think you should when you can, but it's very difficult. I mean, one of the advantages we had with this entire story is that there were oysters dying in our backyard. I mean, that was something tangible already. And B, it was also an excuse to look at all the other things that were maybe a little less tangible. If we hadn't had oysters dying in our backyard, I'd still be in Seattle scratching my head trying to figure out how I'm ever going to write about ocean acidification. I mean, I just don't know that. I mean, sometimes you have to have that sort of initial spark. But what I learned through this process is next time I don't have to wait for it. The next time I can go looking for it. And that doesn't mean looking for, something that's dying, but, looking for the creative way to look into the future to find a way to tell a story. For example, I was talking last week with one of the scientists I visit with regularly, And for the life of me, I don't know why I never thought to ask the guy about his background, but it turns out that his grandfather was a geneticist who helped invent the red potato, and that he lived with his grandfather for years when he was a kid and like subscribed to Science News or some kind of science publication when he was like 6 years old. And I realized that, you know, I can tell a story through this guy now because he's got a great backstory, and I just was too foolish to ever think to ask him about it before. So you just have to be creative in sort of how you approach some of the stories.
I have one last question. That's for the last speaker, the movie director. And just by the way, for the second person, I've forgotten your name. I'm sorry. Please forgive me.
Correct.
Ocean acidification, though, however, has been around for about 40 years. Mm-hmm. They've been talking about it for about 40 years, actually, especially in the Chesapeake. But going back to the last speaker, one of the things that I see that you're trying to do, and I think it's very good because, you know, we already know that the climate is changing. We already know that, but we have to be adaptive. And I think this shows some of the how we have to learn how to be creatively adaptive, but also environmentally adaptive, you know, so that we don't cause more damage. Not that it makes up an excuse to continue to create damage, but it would, to me, that was good that they, you know, that this town, this little, you know, village decided that no, irregardless of whether the water's rising, we still have to educate our children. We still have to, et cetera, et cetera. We still have to survive. And I think that, you know, as a global perspective, we all have to do that. We're going to all have to learn how to adapt, but we're going to also have to learn how to be flexible. And I think it just shows, you know, that even, you know, in Congress and different policies, we're going to have to learn how to be more flexible if we are to survive. Would you agree with that or no?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that's what we were trying to do was show that, you know, these countries that are going to be hardest hit by climate change, they are trying to adapt. There are a lot of bright people there with innovative ideas. And in our film, it was really about them trying to find the funding to continue to adapt to the way they saw it impacting their country. Kind of connected to what Craig was talking about earlier about his story, I think we sort of struggled with how do you connect this to a U.S. Audience. We had Dr. Atik Rahman in the film talking about New York going underwater, and this was all far before Superstorm Sandy. So we at that time we never really we liked his soundbite, but we just were worried that people wouldn't make that connection. And what I liked about Craig's story was immediately I was like, oysters. I love oysters and king crab, and they're dying, and that it's just completely alarming. And I think, you know, if you can tie that approach into your storytelling, we've done it many times at the Pulitzer Center through our what we call global goods, local costs reporting, where we go abroad and find stories about products that have connections back to the U.S. And so it's just a really wonderful tool, I think. You know,
like one of the things you want to look at is sort of the biggest, in terms of where climate change is hitting the most, instead of just impacting people, hitting the most is in the Arctic. But people go, who cares? You know, it's just a bunch of polar bears. And but what the changes in the jet stream are showing you is that what's happening in the Arctic isn't staying there. But then how do you convince editors to send you to the Arctic for a month or two at great expense? And I'm still trying to get that. Maybe the Pulitzer Center would like to. But there's all sorts of fascinating places to go to if you can find a way of getting there that you can then connect. You know, you can say, look, with the theory is what's happening there has affected the cold snap we just had, or the storm we just had. So.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, any other tips for dealing with editors? I mean, it's like, you know, I think I have an idea I think is great, and I send it to an editor, and they're like, well, the payoff's not going to be for 10 years. But then I like read a very similar looking story that someone else wrote. Maybe the editor already had a relationship with this writer or something. But just any other ideas for like what editors, like what will tip them over the edge to being interested.
Are you a freelancer?
I am.
Oh, that's even tougher, isn't it? Yeah.
So what I try to do, and see, I'm not being freelance. It's I have it a little easier. But if I pitch a story, and I really, really care about it, and it gets shot down, I give it about a day, and then come up with another way to pitch the same story from a different angle. And after I've done that 3 or 4 times, sometimes I think my editors will will give me the green light just to shut me up. And to be honest, sometimes it helps if someone else you hear that the New York Times is working on it, or whomever. The threat of competition is always is helpful. The other thing to look at is pitch it multimedia oriented. There's got to be something very visual oriented, something very distinct. The odder you can make it, the better.
I think one way you guys would have an advantage over other reporters would be because you're looking at science, you're talking to scientists. Scientists generally have a lot of data, shape files that can easily be turned into infographics. And in some ways, working with an infographic designer, you can create a story based on those graphics that might help you sell it to an editor. Here's we're going to come up with we did one with Dan McCary in our office. He got all this information on auto accidents around the world, and got these shape files. He created a huge map showing this, and then we started to plot stories based on these numbers that were popping up all over the globe that had to do with traffic fatalities. That story went viral on its own based on the infographics. So that may be another way to entice editors and people.
Write it as a list. Write it as a Q&A. I don't know about you. I hate writing those, but editors love those. And if you've enticed them with a list, maybe you get to write the story that goes with it.
I'd also, if you're writing these kind of stories, if you're trying to write them for magazines, there are some magazine editors who are much more interested in these than others, and figure out who they are. Laura Helmuth at Slate used to be at Smithsonian, and she is a science geek. I mean, this is what she cares about. And she's always looking for new ways to tell the same story. And I will tell you that I pitched her a story a couple of years ago, and she said no. And then I pitched it to her exactly the same way 6 months later, and she said, I love it. So their jobs are like this, and they don't have much time to make decisions. So sometimes you just have to cheat a little bit.
And you may get them on a bad day, so you don't know why you're turned down.
Is there an optimal day of the week?
It's not Monday.
Yeah, or Friday.
Yeah, it's neither of those days. Friday they're trying to escape. Monday they're just overwhelmed.
I've kind of noticed that in the past couple of years, there's been people have looked at another way of, well, I'm sure it's happened before that, but I noticed it with that book Windfall that just came out, this idea that, let's look at this from another angle, that people who are trying to make money off of this, off of the new type of infrastructure, off of desalination, and I just think that's really interesting, and I'm just curious if that's something that any of you are looking at, or if you've got particular stories you've done recently or are working on.
You mean about desalination,
Sorry, just
or
sort of
just
the
sort of the
idea of-
counterintuitiveness?
There's a question of, you can look at the story from a lot of different angles. Of course, there's a lot of people who have a lot to lose, and that's probably the more compelling in some ways and the more important. But it could be an interesting avenue also to look at people who, and also a convincing angle to say, if X person thinks I can make some money off of lack of water supply or what have you, it's another avenue into explaining this that gets people to think, wow, this is a big deal. This is something we should care about. So I guess I'm just curious if that's something that you've come across.
I mean, I remember seeing when that book came out a couple months ago and just seeing the description of it and thinking, why didn't I think of that? Because it was brilliant. I mean, it's a really smart idea. And if you guys don't know, the book is basically a tour through all the people who are finding ways to get rich on climate change and what's to come. And it's just a brilliant idea. And, sometimes just thinking about things in a counterintuitive way. I've yet to see a story that I think really talks about the insurance industry the way I would love to see it talked about, because those people know. And those people also often are big contributors to Congress. And I would love to find somebody who can find a way to get inside that circle and explain sort of how it is that on the one hand, they know this is coming, and on the other hand, they're often dealing with people in Congress who just think it's not happening. I just think there's a great story there somewhere, but I don't know quite what it is yet.
To go back, essentially what you're talking about is if you take the money angle out, which I know, is it's the issue of winners and losers, and we all forget there are winners in climate change. It's not just the winners in terms of money, but it's the winners, there are species winners, and this was a story I should have done, and you could still do it. It would have been perfect today because, you know, I don't like tying things to certain X days, but today is Penguin Day. And, you know, the advocates will talk about here are all these penguins that are going to be in trouble because of climate change. But there's a study that came out in PLOS 1 a few days ago about the Gen 2 penguin. Now, the Gen 2 penguin happens to be sort of the warm-loving penguin of the Antarctic. And during the last glacial maximum, it basically ended up just at the northern tips and the islands, and they were sort of pushed off of Antarctica by the cold. And now they're coming back, and they had the biggest, you know, they're the big winners. And people like reading about winners. And not only is it counterintuitive, but it's, you know, it's if there's a good news, you know, it also goes against everything that, you know, critics say about reporters, that we only like bad news stories. You know, you give me a good news story about climate change, and I will jump right on it. You know, I just didn't have time to write about the Gen 2 penguin, but, you know, go ahead. It's a PLOS 1 right now.
And that's, for the freelancers in the room, that's the kind of stuff that magazine editors want. They want people who think exactly like that, who are going to take all the stuff that they can get out of the newspaper and find a completely twisted way to tell you that's really intriguing and has a narrative to it. And, you know, it requires a lot more thinking.
For example, in the IPCC, there's half of a sentence talking about how the wine industry, wine making is going to be tough. Wine making will be big in British Columbia. You know, who would think you'd go to Vancouver for wine, you know, to get your wine? But in the future, that's what they're talking about. It's just an odd little thing that might be a fun story just in and of itself.
Seattle Times 2010.
Oh, well. See? Oof. Well, that's your backyard.
Some more questions?
So I had two questions. One was about advocacy and activism and scientists trying to maintain their objectivity, and if that's something you worry about. And when do you know that that scientists go over the line from one to the other? And is that okay? And that's you know, are people honest about it when they do it? The other question is about the editor question that came up yesterday, and this notion that editors are asking for two sides of the story. I'm wondering if there's an editors association that could make a statement like AGU would make about climate change, and whether or not the news organizations could come up with a way of trying to identify you know, at what point are certain things known, and therefore we shouldn't be talking about them as news. Or not, or are there things like that are out there that I'm just not aware of?
Okay. Well, first off, you know, hopefully many of you use AP Style, the AP Style book. I like to think that that's close to what you're talking about here. Now, of course, we get things wrong. We are now saying it's okay to say over instead of more than. I'm sorry, it's just a personal pet peeve that. At AP, in the last 8 years since I've been there, you know, there has been no pressure to do the false balance. You do not see that in my stories. You do not see that in most any AP stories that I have a fingerprint on and reading beforehand. You know, there are reasons to put in that when you, for example, you're talking about the jet stream issue. There are two sides in science there, but climate change being real, not really. So you could say, look at what AP does. Look at what the New York Times does. Look at what the Washington Post does. You know, if it's good enough for the New York Times, the Washington Post, AP, Reuters, although, to be honest, Reuters is now getting a little different, but that's another issue. It should be good enough for your editor. And if not, why not? And point them to AGU, point them to AAAS, what we know, point them to the National Academy of Sciences. Ask him, do we say some scientists still think smoking doesn't cause cancer? Because when the IPCC Working Group 1 said they were 95% certain, I actually did a story just saying, what do you mean by 95%? And I went to dozens of scientists in different fields. I went to the top scientists at AAAS, and they essentially said, and these were risk scientists and scientists from everything, said it's essentially the same as how we feel about smoking causing cancer. So, and you can look that story up online. That's another way to think of it. So,
I don't know how, I mean, maybe I'm ignorant, but I don't know how big a problem that still is, honestly. I mean, nobody in my newsroom quotes people who don't believe climate change is real that I know of. And if I find out about it, I will go talk to them myself. But, I also work in a newsroom where my managing editor used to be an environmental reporter. So there's never been, he understands what we're doing. So
the other thing, by the way, though, as a corollary to that, it's perfectly fine to quote these people in a policy story. Saying that climate change is not important is a legitimate policy or politics story. It's not a legitimate science story. Mm-hmm. But going to the Competitive Enterprise Institute about carbon tax, perfectly fine, and I think you should. Or, well, there's so many of them, you could choose your one. But going to them about science, no.
And I was going to say the same thing about politics. So in this, I have to make one correction. In the series that I wrote, we didn't talk to any environmentalists until it came time to do the story about what should be done. And then we talked to Republicans and Democrats, and some of the Democrats were activists and some of the Republicans were activists. So that's where ideology is not a barrier. The science is where it is. So I think it's totally fine. And
then the other question was about the scientists / activists. And that is a really tricky question because there are several examples and it is a blurry line because the scientists who don't talk about, and it's a big issue among the scientists. I hope they talk to you about that. Because if you're just talking the science and not saying this is important, then are you really doing what you should be doing if you think this is a earth-shattering issue? The major environmental issue of our time, then shouldn't you say, hey, this is a big deal? On the other hand, should you be arrested chaining yourself to the White House or the coal plants like Jim Hansen, the godfather of global warming, does? Jim Hansen is probably, like I say, he's called the godfather of global warming. He's the one who brought global warming to the forefront. He still publishes good science. He also publishes incredible advocacy pieces. And it's incumbent on you to know the difference. And to be honest, the only time you see me quote him anymore is if he's publishing good science and it's only about his studies, not about his advocacy. I tend to not go to him for outside comment anymore. And then part of the politics is because they are thrust into the political statue. Michael Mann, who is basically the author of The Hockey Stick that you probably have seen. He is now just an incredible, he's out there all the time and he spars and sues, places like National Review online. And, he's been compared to because they compared him to the Penn State, the Penn State child, no, not Joe Paterno, his Sandusky. He was compared in I think it was National Review, but it was one of those, to that, and he sued. So his name has been dragged through the mud, and they attack him horrendously. And so and other scientists like Ben Santer at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, he retreated. He had a rat sent to him, a dead rat sent to him. He retreated. Mike Mann comes out, and it just makes him more angry and fight. So he is sort of advocacy in that way, but he's also, a regularly published scientist, and I talk to Mike at least once every couple of weeks because he's a good scientist and a good quote. But it's that judgment you have to make. And the other thing, we didn't touch upon this, but when you write about climate science, you're going to get attacked. If you Google me on Google Images, you just don't, I've been photoshopped into a pimp outfit. I've been caricatured with fire coming out. You just got to be ready. I get hate, not just hate email. I've had at least one person who was so bad we had to talk to AP security about this guy. After a while you try not to take it personally. And I like to say I don't, but honestly, it still gets to you. And then how you deal with these people, I try to send back data, and that's harder in Twitter than it is in email. And when they just respond with Rush Limbaugh quotes, it's like, okay, I deal with facts, you can deal with whatever you want. So.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is that I don't have any particular need to deal with Mike Mann, but I do often ask a lot of scientists about the reputations of other scientists, just so that I know whether somebody's coming with baggage that I'm not aware of that would make them less credible. And I mean, some of the scientists that were here yesterday, when I chatted with them in the hall, I was saying, well, what do you know about so-and-so? I mean, I do it all the time, just in case there's something I need to know that will bite me in the ass later.
And then there's one corollary to that, to me, especially if it's in a field, because I have to do all sorts of sciences, and often in fields that I'm not familiar with, sort of become the instant expert. And one of the questions I often ask, and in some ways I ask it as a truth-telling question, is, and you should always do this if you can, should do this if you can, is who do you respect that disagrees with you? And if a scientist say, oh, no one does, then I'm much more suspicious of them. And if they say, no one smart does, then you're again suspicious. If they say, oh, you might want to go to this person, and I've had scientists who say, oh, you might want to go to this person and this person, they're very good, we just disagree, and here's their email. And you go, oh God, here's someone who's confident enough in their work to point you to someone who's going to criticize them. And that's, when they do that, you've got someone really good.
Couple more questions?
I already asked a couple, so if anyone else. Okay. This is sort of a devil's advocate question, but Elizabeth Kolbert wrote a great book on climate change in, 2006, 2007? Did great reporting. Could argue that not much has changed since then, so I guess I'd be interested in any comment on that. And
Absolutely, because you were right into the last thought. Everything's changed since then. And that was the reason that we did this story, is because everything that Elizabeth Kolbert wrote about was about what was going to happen 100 years from now. And instead, it's happening right now. The impact on oysters, there are impacts on coral reefs, there are impacts on mussels, and more. But, that was the whole point, is we have, in the story that we wrote, there's the first main story, and then right below it is a timeline of everything that has happened since 2006. And that date was not random. It was because that was sort of what put ocean acidification on the sort of public map. And you can just see there's boom, 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 boom. A whole bunch of stuff has changed since then. And that's sort of why we felt compelled to do it.
And the issue of extremes wasn't even around when Elizabeth wrote that. And the issue of the extremes is sort of one of these extreme weather events is one of the ones where finally scientists have almost thought like journalists and say, wow, an individual, events that can almost illustrate them and they're real time and that people can think about. So that's something that's new. And the other thing to think of is what you see often in climate is it's gradual, and then there's this giant step to another level. And especially in the Arctic, 2005 was a dramatic step in Arctic sea ice melt, summer sea ice melt. And since then, yes, it's going to go, but it's here where we were instead of being here where we were.
This question is actually related.
Yeah, please wait for the handsome young man with the mic.
In pitching the story and writing the story, is there a way to avoid fatalism? Because people are going to say, well, the hell with it, I can't do anything. The famous Far Side cartoon with the 3 nuclear clouds, let's catch all the fish. That's liable to be the reaction. And I think it's the other side of denial.
Well, first off, you got to, the first thing to remember is my job isn't to to convince people to do something or not something. It's to hold the mirror. And the mirror really isn't fatalism right now. I mean, that's, you know, there are all these horrible things that can happen and are happening, but there's a but. The trouble is, one, scientists aren't very good about talking about that but, and two, reporters are even worse at it because there are things like adaptation, and it's just so damn boring. And it's things like carbon tax, which is so politically unpalatable and not science. So, you know, the only way to avoid it is to try, you know, is to not be over the top, you know, but for some things, you know, it's pretty bleak. And, you know, you have to be the mirror.
A few years ago, the World Bank held, I think it was a climate change adaptation contest, and there were hundreds of entrants, and there were people from all over the world with really, really interesting, fun, innovative ideas to adapting to climate change. And I thought, you know, as a journalist, this was just, you know, a gold mine of cool stories from, you know, the Philippines and Africa, South America, all related to climate change. And I think, you know, going back to, you know, finding that counterintuitive story, that was a whole room full of it. Kind of, you know, these are all good pitches. I saw pitches left and right that I could have sold as video stories.
And actually, Bangladesh is one of the hot spots of adaptation. I was talking, do you know Salamil Huq?
We met him, yes.
He's a wonderful scientist in both Bangladesh and England.
Yep.
And he was telling me the other day that Bangladesh is probably leading the world in adaptation, although it's very local oriented, it's not money oriented. And we can learn a lot of lessons from.
Yeah.
There are also foundations like the Paul Allen Fund and was it the Wendy Schmidt Prize? Foundations are basically asking for people to submit ideas for adaptation. You know, this is where like the Let's Grow Eelgrass plots and stuff like that come from. And a lot of those, the winners and some of the applicants are right online. And some of them are very local. Some of them are like, you know, specifically in a bay in Texas or specifically in a bay in Virginia or something.
Google X Prize. X Prize does an awful lot of things, but there's a couple environmental X Prizes.
Yeah. And, you know, I also, as part of this series, we wrote a story about the potential for evolution and whether or not evolution can actually help. And there are some promising signs for both a rapid evolution and acclimatization, so acclimation. I think there is hope out there.
Except the American public doesn't believe in evolution.
This has been great. I hate to cut us off. So do connect with everyone after if you still have some questions, and want to thank our panel for this morning. Thank you.